Hello, this is your buddy Quinn, and this is the introduction to a wonderful Iranian film called A Separation. Separation is a 2011 film directed by Asghar Farhadi, one of Iran's most important contemporary directors. This is a really complex and layered film. It's also a very highly awarded film. It's won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, was the first Iranian film to win that award. That was also the first Iranian film to win the top prize at the Berlin Film Festival. The film is 2 hours long, and it's very easy to rent for streaming. You can do that on Amazon or on other movie streaming services. A Separation deals with some complex topics about relationships and about families. And so it may not be suitable for all audiences, but it doesn't have any explicit content, and I think it would easily be suitable for anyone who's capable of dealing with mature themes in terms of relationships. This is the final film that I will be introducing in this film series, and I think it's a really lovely one to end on. I want to just introduce Iranian film and some of the Iranian context of the film before I begin. Then I'll turn to the production and director and spend quite a bit of time talking about some of the big themes of the film, what makes this film a really wonderful film for me, and some things that I want you to watch for. So if you look at all of Middle Eastern film, there's good Middle Eastern film coming from Turkey, from Israel, and from much of the Arab world. I think most people would agree that Iranian film is the richest. It has the longest tradition, all the way back to the beginning of film. Persia, as it was then called, had a film industry, and that film industry, over the course of Iranian independence and even after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, has been a really prominent artistic force in the country. Iranian film was highly influenced in the 50s and 60s by the Italian neorealist movement, which we've seen before in a couple of films like The Battle of Algiers and Bicycle Thieves in this series. And in the 1960s and 70s, prior to the Iranian Revolution, was really a golden age in many respects in Iran. And even after 1979, where the country had a revolution that led to a lot of censorship, Iranian film has found a way to thrive and even to make some creative choices, in part due to the restrictions on the industry, that have allowed it to be particularly interesting and artistic. There were a lot of pro-war, pro-nationalist films immediately after the Iranian Revolution. So in 1980, 1 year after the revolution, Iran and Iraq embarked upon a very long and painful war called the Iran-Iraq War, lasted about eight years. And the Iranian film industry was harnessed to make pro-war propaganda films during that period of time. But after that war ended, and particularly by the time we get to the 2000s, I think that you see a transformation of post-revolution Iranian film that has made it one of the most productive cinema industries in terms of total number of films, and also I think without a doubt the most critically acclaimed on the international scene. There are some really outstanding Middle East films coming from places outside of Iran. Many of those have really come out in the last decade or so, but there are many that are worth watching, in addition to many other Iranian films outside of Separation. There are a few aspects of the Iranian context that I think will help you appreciate this film a little bit more. The first I've already alluded to, which is that the most important event in the modern history of Iran was the Iranian Revolution in 1979. Prior to that, Iran had a king known as the Shah, and a dynasty of father and son called the Pahlavi dynasty came to an abrupt end in 1979. There were a lot of grievances against the Shah's regime. Some of them had to do with extensive corruption, some had to do with a lot of political oppression, some had to do with a tendency to look away from some of the religious and other traditions of the country that upset certainly the clerics that were dependent upon that tradition, but also many people in popular society. And the revolution was very widespread. It was not an Islamic revolution at the beginning. It was a revolution that had communists, it had secularists, liberals, and clerics, and many people in the merchant class. They came together to overthrow the Shah. But within about a year of that revolution, the various strands of the revolution had become consolidated, largely through repression, but had been consolidated into what later became known as the Islamic Revolution, led by Ayatollah Khomeini. And it created a new system of government in Iran called an Islamic Republic. No one had ever seen an Islamic Republic before, and this was quite a creative solution. Much of it was developed by Khomeini himself. But Iran has a political structure that is partly democratic, it's partly Republican in that sense, that you have a president, you have a legislature, both of whom are elected. But you also have layered onto that a theocracy. So a supreme leader who is a religious cleric, a council of guardians that is a group of religious clerics that vet legislation and candidates for appropriateness with the Islamic constitution, the purposes of the Islamic Revolution. And so you end up having kind of a mixed democratic, theocratic regime in Iran. And it's layered on top of a society that was long held to be one of the more liberal and progressive societies in the Middle East. In fact, if you do public opinion surveys across the Middle East, you'll see that Iran has one of the largest segments of left-leaning people in the region. But there is this quite conservative, it's kind of an interesting mix of conservatism in terms of moral conservatism and revolutionary fervor, right, that comes out of the Islamic Revolution. But you have this autocratic, quite repressive, theocratic government that is layered on top of a relatively liberal society. But Iranian society is very, very complex, and it has many strands to it, some of whom support the revolution, some of whom are deeply opposed to the revolution. There are some social issues in Iran that come out in this movie. These are common across much of the Middle East. But we see issues about the importance of honor in the family and social respect. There is an honor to the women in the family. It's often tied to their seclusion from much of society, and that could be physical seclusion in terms of their dress or avoiding contact with other men. But there's also an honor of men in this film. And the honor of men that we see is really tied in many respects to their ability to provide for a family, their ability to be independent and provide. And that's a very important in terms of fulfilling the male role in Iranian society and much of Middle Eastern society. We also see in this context in Iranian society a lot of religious issues. So Iran, as a result of the revolution, has an official religious stance, has an official religious structure, and whenever that happens, right, it sometimes becomes hard to tell if an individual's piety is genuine, if it's based in sincere belief, or if it's based in public conformity, right, or a showmanship or a politicking. And that's a theme that does come up here. It's very prominent in contemporary Iran. One final issue that comes up, because much of this film is about justice, is that in Islamic law, there is a principle of what is called retributive justice. Qisas is the term in Arabic, and it's part of Sharia law. The principle is that if one commits an injustice against another, the one that committed the injustice needs to provide restitution somehow. And taken to its extreme, you could imagine that if one commits murder, then to provide retributive justice, you could be sentenced to death, right, and give up your own life as retribution for that crime. But there are some exceptions. So in the case of murder, for example, if a victim's family chose to pardon, that would be acceptable under Islamic law. They could pardon you. Or you could fulfill the requirement of retributive justice, not by giving your own life, but by providing a financial contribution, right? And this is sometimes casually referred to as blood that we could negotiate a restitution in terms of a financial payment that would leave the victim satisfied, but it would also satisfy the demands of retributive justice, and that could be negotiated. That principle puts quite a bit of power in the hands of a victim's family to decide what adequate restitution for injustice might look like. Now, onto the film. As I mentioned, this is a highly awarded film, and the director, Asghar Farhadi, is one of my favorite international directors. He's had a number of films that I've deeply enjoyed. He's very much an Iranian filmmaker. He was born in Iran. He is committed to Iran, and he focuses primarily on Iranian issues. He also often speaks out in defense of his country on the international scene. But he has run afoul of the government on a couple of occasions. As he was making this film, actually in the early stages of making this film, he was punished by the government for making a speech at a cinema event in which he called for the exile of a prominent Iranian film director to be rescinded, and the punishment of other directors who were considered to be too close to the opposition. This film was made right after a movement in Iran emerged called the Green Movement, which put a lot of pressure on the existing government to reform. And many artists were caught up in this movement that pushed for more democratic change. And some of them were punished for that. And so Farhadi, when he stood up and spoke on behalf of those artists, was also punished by requiring a ban on all filming during this production. He said that he was misunderstood and apologized for any comments that were taken in an offensive way, and his ban was lifted, and he was able to proceed with this film. He didn't take any financial aid from the government for this film, and it was made on a limited budget of only $800,000, really quite a remarkable feat. But this film did very well financially and is the most successful Iranian film on the international market. And so it has been a very successful film. Even though it won a lot of awards, people who are close to the Iranian regime did criticize this movie. It wasn't banned in Iran, but it was criticized as being too critical of certain aspects of Iranian society and opening up that criticism of Iranian society to the outside world. And so it was not universally applauded, but it is part of a series of themes that Farhadi is very, very good at. So he's great at looking at domestic dramas, daily life dramas. A film that I thoroughly enjoyed that came prior to this in 2009 was about Ellie, also a Farhadi film. And then a film that came after this, The Salesman in 2016, also won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, which makes Farhadi one of the very few directors that has won that award twice. In addition to filming in Persian language and in Iran, he's directed a French language film, he's directed a Spanish language film, and so he's really quite an interesting director. In 2017, when his next film, The Salesman, won the Academy Award for Best Foreign Language Film, Farhadi actually didn't come and attend the Oscars at that time. That was during a period of time when the Trump administration had banned Iranians from coming into the country. In solidarity with Iranians that could not come, he refused to come to the Oscars. And interestingly, all 5 directors that year in 2017 that were nominated for Best Foreign Language Film issued a joint statement supporting Farhadi and condemning what they called the fanaticism and nationalism that had plagued the United States and other countries. Of note, Farhadi's daughter, Serena Farhadi, plays an important role in this film. She's only a young woman, but she plays 11-year-old Terme, one of the key characters in the film, and does a great job. So turning now to what makes this film particularly special. And I want to start by talking a little bit about the structure of the film. It's a sequential narrative. It, again, largely is filmed in a neorealist style in domestic situations in Iran. And the film is essentially about 2 separate families. They live somewhat parallel lives, but in very different social contexts. Both families consist of a married couple and one daughter. So the first family I'll talk about is upper class. And Nader and Samin are the couple. They have an 11-year-old daughter, Terme, I just mentioned, was played by the director's daughter. Nader, the husband in this family, is also caring for an elderly parent. He has his own father who's suffering from Alzheimer's. And so we see the elderly parent in this family as well. The second family of interest is a lower class family. And it's composed again of a couple, Hojat and Razieh. They have a 7-year-old daughter. Her name is Samaya. And these families ultimately become intertwined in this film because the wife of the lower class couple is hired to watch the elderly father with dementia of the upper class couple. The very first idea that came to the director for this film was actually a scene of a man cleaning his father who has Alzheimer's. And that scene does exist in this film. And if you know that that was the kernel of the film, I think it also helps to understand how the rest of the film got put together around that core idea. This upper class film, which forms the core of the film, the upper class family that forms the core of the film, is also on the verge of a divorce. There are multiple ways of thinking about what the title, a separation, means, but it certainly could mean the potential for divorce in this upper class family. It could also have broader social context, meaning a separation between the upper classes and the lower classes, or separation between parents and children, for example. One of the things that I love about this film, that I think is a really fine tightrope to walk, is that all of the characters are deeply sympathetic. We can understand each of the characters and some of their motivations, but each of these sympathetic characters are also flawed. And so generating sympathy for everyone from the audience, but also revealing their flaws is the magic in many ways of this film. The screenplay and the dialogue are very tight. The director does a great job of keeping a film about relatively mundane topics moving very rapidly. We're never bored in this movie. And it was the first Iranian film ever to be nominated for a Best Original Screenplay at the Oscars. There's some interesting camera choices here. At times the camera, for example, is from the perspective of the person being addressed. And I think that has a lovely effect. But probably the thing that makes this film most important to me, and the richness of it, is that it is very complex in terms of the themes that it addresses. So in a short, concise amount of time, the film deals with a really rich array of themes. Social class is one of the most important, but gender roles is very important. Religious piety, aging and dementia, parents caring for children, right? Parents caring for their parents, right? Truth and its consequences is a major theme of the film. And ultimately, I think this film is about the meaning of justice and how we should understand justice in a complex world. Now, all of those themes together in 2 hours, that's a huge agenda for any film. And Farhadi makes that kind of ambitious agenda, I think, really look effortless here. There are several things that I invite you to watch out for as you watch A Separation. And I want to make the case in the introduction here that this is a film that's not only about two families, but it is also a parable of contemporary Iran. And I encourage you to look at the characters, not only for their own merits, and they're wonderful characters. They evolve and develop, and they're acted very thoroughly. But I think each of those characters also represents a broader social construct in Iran. So we'll start by watching for issues of social class. And those issues can be seen symbolically from the Ray-Ban sunglasses worn by the wife of the upper class family, Samin. She's wealthier, her car, the ease with which she has access to resources, even her name, Samin, in Persian means made of silver. By contrast, the poorer family is under much more financial pressure. They are confined to public transportation or a motor scooter. They really struggle to get access to resources. And often we see a case in this movie that the upper class could be structurally advantaged against the poorer classes. And that leads to a lot of resentment and even anger that the poor could erupt against that injustice. I think we could compare that perhaps to the populist movement in the United States. This is not an Iranian-only issue. So watch also for the role of education. And education is an important theme, particularly in the parent-child relationship, and what is being learned as a sign of the upper class priorities through the theme of education. The upper class family is also notably less religious, while the lower class family in the movie abounds in symbols of piety. From the names of the family members, Razia, the wife in that family, her name means something like satisfied with God's will. Their 7-year-old daughter, her name, Sumaya, was a very popular name after the Iranian Revolution took place and was the name of the first martyr in Islam. You can see differences in the way they treat religion, in the way that the women in both families dress, the way that they wear their headscarves, for example. In one important scene, Razia, the wife of the lower class family, gets on the telephone to something like a religious hotline to get some advice on what is appropriate religious behavior. And that's a service that's often quite prominent in Islamic countries. So if you have a question about what is acceptable in Islam, there are people out there who are designed to answer that. In the upper class family, you also notice in terms of gender, the wife has much more independence. She is less constrained by issues of honor and piety, whereas in the lower class family, we see much more distinctive gender roles. Razia has more in the way of perceived restrictions on her contact with men outside of the family. So not only are these two families living in quite different worlds, but if you pay close attention, you'll notice that each family is also split down the middle. In the upper class family, there's a division between husband and wife about whether to leave Iran for a better life for them and their family, or to stay and to take care of what remains for them in the country. In part, what remains for them in the country is symbolized by this elderly father who requires a lot of care. He was clearly born before the revolution and could be thought of as a pre-revolutionary relic of something that needs to be preserved. And that division between staying or going represents a broader dilemma of the upper classes in Iran. In the lower class family, there is a division over piety between the husband and wife. How genuine is your belief? How genuine is the piety? Or is piety socially useful, right? Is it useful to get you what you want? And I think that also represents a broader dilemma in the classes that were lifted up, often the poorer classes lifted up by the Iranian Revolution, about whether religion, religious belief is genuine to them and is part of their identity, or how much of that is a political tool or a social tool to access resources in this religious state. And then there are the children. The children, I think, are the stars of the story, both of the daughters in these families, because they are the keepers of knowledge and truth. They are the ones who see both of their parents act in different ways. They see multiple sides of the story. And they also are set up as the future of Iran. They are agents, people that have choice about the direction that they take in the future. I see the older daughter depicted in the film, Terme. Terme is a name that means precious, and in many ways she is the most important character in the film. She is the central focal point around which the action and around which Iranian society, by implication, swirls. Many of the scenes in A Separation deal with the quest for justice. I think that's a wonderful theme of this movie. What do we learn about justice here? What are the consequences of injustice? Can injustice be maintained without revolt or without protest? And the intersection between truth and justice is an important theme. So how important is knowing and stating the truth publicly to accomplishing the work of justice? Sometimes we do injustices to others, and we do them relatively innocently. So how do we atone for injustices when they were done innocently or even accidentally? At what point does ego and honor and our own identity get in the way of, uh, of acknowledging injustices that we unwittingly create and trying to make those better? A couple of minor points just to pay attention to. There's a seemingly um, unimportant scene at the beginning where movers are coming into the home. I encourage you to pay attention to that scene. I want you to note that in the final scene of the film, that all of the main characters are wearing black. And I'd like you to think about the implications of that and what that means in the story. Both of those are tied gently and quite subtly into the plot. Ultimately, I think a separation is about the dying pre-revolutionary classes in Iran, the aborted promise of the revolution, and all of those who are caught up in the middle. From diverse aspects of society, the rich and the poor, the pious, the non-pious, the men and the women. And it's about ultimately the importance of truth and the complications of justice. I personally think Separation is a superb film. It's very clever in many ways, and I hope that it whets your appetite for more of what Iranian cinema can offer. It's a great start, and there are other great films that I would suggest by this director and others. So enjoy A Separation, and I appreciate you following along with me during this introduction and during this series.